Continue our study in Exodus. We'll be in chapter 23 and chapter 24 this evening, where we continue with God revealing the contents of the Book of the Covenant to the Israelites through Moses. And the Book of the Covenant, it spans, I think I had that up there. Yeah, it spans from chapter 20 with the Ten Commandments all the way through to the end of chapter 23. And last time I divided God's laws in chapters 21 and 22 into 18 different categories. Well, those laws spilled over also into chapter 23, so I just added 4 more categories, so there's 22 in total. But it just kind of helps you see the big picture of God and what He's looking for from His people. So the ones that I added were justice in court, love for neighbor, Sabbath rest, and laws about worship to God. So in a moment, after the prayer, we're going to focus on this question: what do these laws in Exodus 23 teach us about God's character and nature? Before we do that, let's go to God in prayer. Father in heaven, we praise your name. We thank you so much for your wisdom in giving this amazing law to your people, to make them holy, to make them set apart, and to teach them things about your heart and your character so that they could be accurate reflections of you in the world. They could be a bright, shining light to the nations around them. We know, Father, how much they failed to do that and how much we fail as well. And we're so grateful for your forgiveness and for the fact that we can continue to be in covenant with you despite our imperfections, despite our sins, because you're a forgiving, loving, gracious God. Thank you so much for giving us that perfect sacrifice, the blood of the new covenant, so that we can have this eternal relationship with you. Bless us in our study this evening. Help us to dig out some truths from your text and use those things to change our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so what do you guys think about the answer to this question? What do these laws in Exodus 23 teach us about God's nature and character? All right, Randy?
Well, that He loves us enough to guide us and keep us out of trouble if we'll just follow Him. He just really cares about us.
Okay. Yeah, He cares about us, sure. Sorry, I didn't think this was like a super hard question. Okay, maybe it's too easy. I don't know. Maybe it's the first time y'all thought about this question. I don't know. Ryan?
Yeah, we see. we see that God is laying out some good laws that help to counteract kind of the desires of humanity, right? So He says, don't go with a crowd to bear false witness in order to pervert justice. Mm-hmm. On the seventh year, let your crops lay dormant. Don't be greedy and continue doing that. Number one, that's nice because of the reasons God says let the poor among you have it. But two, that returns some of that nutrient to the ground. It kind of just helps in an agrarian society to keep that land fertile for years to come in a way, and kind of helps counteract some of that greediness that could come from that. He gives testament on not to treat poor people differently from rich people in the justice system. All of those things that kind of counteract the potential human desire to do things for self-gain.
Okay, good. Yeah, so He's demonstrating a superior moral character to our normal human tendencies. And a lot of times it's kind of the opposite of what we would normally want to do. God very clearly, by giving us these laws, shows us He's not like us at all. His ways are so much higher than our ways. His thoughts higher than our thoughts. How about He's honest? He values truth, right? He's all about don't bear false witness against your neighbor, because He's an honest God who tells the truth. He takes lies and gossip and slander and false narratives very seriously. In His law. That should tell us something about His character. He's impartial in His judgment. He doesn't care how much money you have. He doesn't care what you look like. He doesn't care if you're a celebrity or if you're just a bum on the side of the street who has nothing. Like, God doesn't view you that way. He sees you as a valuable human being made in His image, but also somebody that He's going to hold accountable for your moral actions no matter what social strata you are in. He cares for the needy. He makes provisions to protect them. He wants people to love their enemies because that's the kind of God He is. He loves His enemies. He wants us to worship Him, okay? And He doesn't do that because He's just selfish and He just, well, I deserve all the credit. He does deserve all the credit, but this isn't just a prideful thing. He's doing it because he's trying to keep us from worshiping idols that can't save us and that actually only end up destroying our lives. And He values unity, right? He wants His people to be one nation, one community, even though they're divided up over 12 different places. I don't know, maybe I was expecting y'all to read my mind too much on that question. I don't know, but there was like 7 answers there that I had. The point is, all of these flow directly out of God's nature and character. These laws are not arbitrary. We read, and it's so helpful when you're reading these to think, what is this law teaching us about God's character? Because we read them and our eyes glaze over and we're like, I'm not a Jew, I'm not under the law of Moses, who cares? Okay, but as you examine each individual law, I think it's so important not to just view them as external regulations, but to see them as expressions of God's own heart and His desire. And this was the problem when Jesus came. People totally missed the point of God's laws. They thought, those are just external regulations. Yeah, it's good not to go and commit physical adultery with somebody. And so they would, not do that. But then they'd go around lusting in their hearts. And she said, you're missing the point. You know that law about not committing physical adultery? That's not all that law was about. That law was about having a heart that's faithful to your spouse. Having a heart that's not filled with envy and jealousy and covetousness for someone else's spouse. And then, of course, having a heart that's not fantasizing and objectifying another human being, especially one that doesn't belong to you. Okay, so Jesus, he had a lot of those sort of facepalm moments with people who totally missed the point and the heart behind these laws. All right, let's talk specifically then about verses 1 through 9, laws for how to treat people. And this might be another question that I'm asking you to read my mind too much about. I don't know. But let's read verses 1 through 3. You shall not bear a false report. Do not join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not follow the masses in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after a multitude in order to pervert justice, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his dispute. How are these 3 verses maybe particularly relevant in our modern American society? Again, maybe that's too mind-ready, but we'll see if you are on the same wavelength as me on this one. And by the way, the PowerPoint is just going to be very bare bones. I just didn't have time to do much detail today. Yeah, Mike?
It just cracks me up when I watch TV with my dad at lunch or in the evening. You see lawyer commercials, and it's continuous, like Morgan and I forget the other guys. But it's a steady stream of different lawyers looking for cases so people think they can sue and make money.
Okay.
So
yeah, I think that's really pertinent. Even if it involves maybe fudging the truth a little bit, right? I want to get my check from Dan Newland, so I got to get my facts together, for this case. All right. Rachel's got one.
I think that in American society, something that's very important to us is the truth, and just something that I think is like we don't like to be lied to, and
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot. It's funny. I think we're kind of like we have a double standard. When people are dealing with us, we really want the truth. But then it's like if they're dealing with our political opponents, well then that's fine. You can kind of make it up wherever you want. Joe?
Yes. Don't follow the crowd. That was pretty obvious there.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, social media. Okay. The corporate media. A lot of times there's like this narrative that goes out in our culture that's like the popular narrative that everybody's on board with, many times fueled by the corporate media. And I have to be very careful because I just get very frustrated with our media, and that's actually what I was mostly thinking about, because it's long been established that our media is much more concerned with being first than with being correct and accurate and truthful. And if they can get ratings, they can kind of embellish some things to get more ratings, get more money, right? Perpetuate this narrative that's popular, then that's what they'll do. And honestly, and I'm going to be careful not to use specific examples because it's just going to be hard to not sound too political if I do that. But people's lives have literally been destroyed by our media because of the lies that they told about these people. And then our society believed those lies and went along with the masses, okay? And then this person's life was destroyed. I think our entire society has been very much damaged by false narratives in the media, especially when news anchors, and I don't know how to control this. I wouldn't know how to control this without hampering free speech. But what drives me insane is when news anchors make comments on court cases long before they happen. And what that does is that can actually have the power to sway verdicts. It can actually put a narrative in the mind of juries, okay, and then make juries feel pressured to go along with that narrative. And if they don't, well, then there might be, some persecution or some consequences to that. And the jury, to avoid that, is just going to go along with the masses. And whatever the mass says, well, then that's what I'm going to say. And then justice is perverted. Okay, so those are a couple things I thought of. Yeah, John, and then Randy.
In verse 3, in verse 3 it says, "You shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute." Could you explain that a little bit? Because
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
it seems like you almost want to be partial to the poor.
Yeah. So, well, that's also part of my answer to this. So I'll get there in just a second. Let me just finish this last statement that many times media news anchors will report on a court case before the facts come out. Facts are released progressively from cases, and they'll just speak very confidently. Oh, we know exactly what happened. We got to figure it out. This person's terrible. They're slandering an innocent person sometimes, okay, because they don't have the fact. And then when the facts come out later, they ignore those facts. They just move on. There's no apology whatsoever, and they just move on like it's nothing. And we need to be careful not to get sucked into that ourselves. And to say, well, my favorite news station said X about it, and so that must be what it is, when you don't have all the facts either. We have to be very careful not to, speak too quickly. The Proverbs warn about that all the time. Now, to John's question, I think this is particularly pertinent in our culture because of critical theory. And what I talked about for Cultural Sunday a while back, that divides our culture into two groups, oppressed and oppressors. Because what happens is if you are then in an oppressed group, if there's a dispute between two people, and one person is in the oppressor group and they have power, and the other person is in the oppressed group and they have less power or less money or influence, that person in the oppressed group is assumed innocent. They are given the benefit of the doubt because, well, they're the oppressed person, like they couldn't be wrong. And that is total partiality. That is something God is absolutely against. And I love how brilliant God is here because he's covering all the bases. Typically, you would be partial to a wealthy man in a court case. Because if I'm partial to the wealthy man, maybe I get on the wealthy man's good side, maybe make a little money, right? But you can also be partial to a poor man simply because you're sympathetic to his plight. And look, maybe a poor person does have a rough life. Okay, but if he commits a crime, it's still a crime, whether he's poor or not. You can be sympathetic. You can understand, okay, maybe why he did it. The Proverbs actually talks about that too. Like there's a difference sometimes between somebody who steals just, because he likes it and somebody who's stealing just because he needs to make a living. But the Proverbs still recognize the guy who steals because he needs something to eat, he still has to make restitution for that. It's still wrong. Okay, so God says it doesn't matter what the circumstances are. If you're an innocent person, then you're innocent. If you're guilty, then you're guilty. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. But our society has set up this structure to where all the benefit of the doubt is given to the oppressed groups. And the oppressors are assumed, even if you're in that group, that they're the guilty ones in this case. And they're going to have a hard time proving otherwise in our current culture and system. Yeah, Randy?
Yeah, I remember several years ago there was a case, and the police officers were charged, but the jury acquitted them after hearing the evidence. The federal government came in and recharged them again, and fearing a riot, they ended up being two innocent police officers going to prison. That's not justice.
Happens all the time.
That's kind of what you're talking about.
Happens all the time. Yes, it's so sad. It's infuriating, and it infuriates God because God values honesty, not false witness, not false narratives, not going along with the mob and the masses, okay, but truth and real justice. And this is he also mentions like colluding, kind of like colluding with witnesses to make up a false charge, okay, against somebody. That was huge in their system because by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact would be confirmed. Well, if you could go and you could actually corrupt 2 or 3 people and get them to collude with you on a case, well, then you're really perverting justice. And that's exactly what they did to Jesus. They actually convinced people that Jesus, he's against Rome and he doesn't want us to pay our taxes. And they're making up false reports to try to bias the crowds and to bias the Roman courts against him. It's horrible injustice. All right, Carol?
I just think today we look at people and we automatically classify them. We classify them by their clothes they're wearing. We classify them as Democrats or Republicans, white, black, anything. I mean, they're all in a class.
Yep.
And God doesn't see people that way. He just sees an individual with a heart and a soul, and it doesn't matter whether they're rich, poor, or otherwise. And it's very hard for us to think that way.
Yes.
And to get rid of those classifications that we're always being thrown at.
Absolutely. It's called identity politics, and it is straight from Satan. It is so destructive because that's what it does. It divides everybody up, the different identities, and it creates division and hostility and envy and hatred. It doesn't create unity at all and truth and justice at all. All right. Verses 4 and 5, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey wandering away, you shall surely return it to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying helpless under its load, you shall refrain from leaving it to him. You shall surely release it with him. I love this because in verse 4, it mentions your enemy, which kind of sounds like you hate him. But in verse 5, it sounds like he hates you. Okay, so it covers all the bases and commands them to do good for their enemies no matter what. And really, this becomes the basis for Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan about loving your enemies. Verse 6 is the perfect counterbalance to verse 3. Okay, because in verse 3 he said, don't show partiality to the poor. But then here he's saying, don't show partiality to the rich, right? Make sure not to pervert justice against your needy poor brethren, right? So God, again, he covers all bases there. And then verse 7, keep far from a false charge and do not kill the innocent or the righteous, for I will not acquit the guilty. Again, this is exactly what they did to Jesus. It's where lies and slander and false narratives and perversion of justice ultimately leads. It leads to the death of the innocent. And notice God says, I will not acquit the guilty. He is the Supreme Court. See, that's the thing. Even under the law of Moses system, you could probably get away with it from an earthly perspective, lying and colluding and making up a false report. You could probably get away with that in your lifetime because there's no way the judges would find out. Maybe there could be in some cases, but a lot of times you just get away with it. But God's saying, you'll never get away with it with me because I see all of it. God is the Supreme Court. Okay, so you can get away with a lot of things in human court. You're not going to get away with it in the end in God's court, especially when the lies you're telling are destroying innocent lives. Any comments or questions on verse 9 before we continue? I know that was intense. I'm just passionate about that particular subject. All right, Chris.
This isn't really verse 9. I'm sorry, but the ones in between. I just kind of wanted to make the comment. I think there's a lot of application here. Also, hanging up on my words here, in regards to things a lot of even Christians I've known who do, and that's we think of corporations as being an exception to the rule when it comes to, take for example, pirating copyrighted material. And you hear a lot of people out there saying, well, they can afford it. They're big. They're the big guy. They have a lot of money, therefore it's okay. And they sort of have this moral justification of attacking an entity just because of that. And I think you're talking about not being impartial to the rich, and I think that kind of applies there. If we're supposed to respect the law of the land, I mean, I think it's just something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's a principle of like, don't be applying double standards. Don't be applying this standard to this group of people and this standard to that group of people. No, you treat everybody under law equally and hold everybody equally accountable and treat everybody with equal dignity and respect. All right. Something else about these 22 categories of law in chapters 21 to 23 that I think is just a really important lesson. That is that God wants His law to permeate every aspect of our lives. We have a tendency as human beings to just compartmentalize things and to say like, okay, well, I'm gonna serve God, at Jerusalem, at the temple. When I'm there, I'm going to offer my sacrifices and all that. But then when I go home, well, that's my time. And we maybe do the same thing. We're tempted to say, hey, on Sundays, that's God's day. That's the Lord's day, right? Which means all the rest aren't the Lord's day. They're my day. And if we're not careful, that's kind of the conclusion we draw. But God here, He's saying, I do want your religion. Yes, I want your festivals. I want you in Jerusalem for those 3 yearly feasts. He's like, but I also want every single interaction you have with every person in your community to take me into account. I want to be in your heart, in your life, every day, in just your day-to-day work life, in your day-to-day conversations that you have. That's what this law is showing, that the law is applied not just publicly in court cases, right, but even privately in the day-to-day living. In all these random situations, like you see, somebody's donkey get lost and you go and help them bring the donkey back home. God just wants His law to permeate our lives. I love that. All right, chapter 23. I'm sorry, I forgot. I have a PowerPoint that's not as robust, so I can't click like I normally do. The Sabbath year and the Sabbath day. This is verses 10 through 13. God didn't just want His people to have rest from the curse of toilsome labor by taking that one day off. Okay, He wanted the land to have rest too. And so God actually gave the land one whole year. On the seventh year, every seventh year, the land was to rest, which from an agricultural perspective, that's actually a good thing for the land. It helps the land to be restored and be more productive in the following years. And it was a way also, as Ryan mentioned earlier, to let the needy come in and eat from your field instead of you going out and harvesting those things for yourself. It was also the year that they let their Hebrew slaves go free, and they were supposed to release all debts that were owed to them, which Deuteronomy 15 gets into that later. So here's the thing. It took a lot of trust just to take like one day off. But can you imagine how much it took to trust God to take a whole year off of work? It's why the Israelites didn't do this. They really did not practice this. If they did, it was only very briefly, but then they just kind of end up not doing it. And so, interestingly, when God sent them off into captivity to Babylon for 70 years, He said, now the land can finally have its rest. I'm going to give the land 10 Sabbath rests while you're in captivity, because I'm making up for lost time because you guys did not take that seriously. It's a consistent theme all throughout Scripture that God not only cares about His people, He cares about the condition of the land that He gave them. He doesn't just want to redeem and rescue His people from the curse of sin. He wants to rescue the land from the curse of sin as well. And the Sabbath year was a great way to restore the land by giving it a break from humanity's intense labor caused by the curse of sin. All right, then you have the 3 yearly feasts, verses 14 through 19. And I love how God works this section about the feasts right into the book of the covenant, because it's such a great reminder that these laws are not just external rituals, but they're connected to Him directly. It's not just about following rules, it's about a covenant relationship. And these 3 yearly feasts would help them remember God should always be their focus and motivation for keeping the law. So you could summarize the main purposes of these feasts would be to remind them whose they are, right? Each time they went to a feast, it reminded them where they came from, and it reminded them who's providing for them. It also gave them an opportunity to teach their kids about God. Now, it does say that the males were required to go, but their families could come as well. It's just the males were kind of like the minimum. At least the men of the family have to come. If the women and children want to come too, that's fine. And the children, when they did, they'd ask their parents, what does this feast mean? And it gave them a great opportunity to teach them. And then it gave them an opportunity to unify the people. Because remember, they'd be divided, 12 tribes spread out throughout the land. But 3 times a year, they were supposed to all come to Jerusalem and remember the one true God that they're all united under, who saved them from Egypt. Now, if you think about it, when the kingdom split into north and south, the very first thing Jeroboam did in the north is change the place of worship. And he says, don't want them going down to Jerusalem anymore because then they might follow King Rehoboam. So I'm gonna make it Dan and Bethel instead. Well, once they did that, now they're going to 2 different places, really 3 different places for these feasts. And eventually, many of them stopped going altogether, to the point where, like Dwayne talked about on Sunday, Josiah looks up and realizes they haven't kept the Passover feast in centuries. No wonder they were so divided. Right? If they would have just done what God said here and continue to gather 3 times a year for these feasts, they probably would not have split the way that they did and had so much disunity. The feast of Passover and unleavened bread reminded them of their salvation from Egypt. The feast of Pentecost was a Thanksgiving celebration about the first fruits of the harvest, that God actually, gave them these crops, and now we have faith and hope that more crops will be there to come. And then the feast of ingathering, or the feast of booths, that marked the end of the agricultural cycle. They're thanking God for all of His provisions for the crops for the year, and then they would build these little, it was called the Feast of Booths because they'd build these little tents to live in for the 7 days, and it would remind them of the tents that they lived in the wilderness on their journey to the Promised Land. Verses 18 and 19, God didn't want leaven to be part of the sacrifices, perhaps because there's some connection between leaven and sin. The Bible does kind of make that point, not that leaven is sin, but just kind of this idea of purge the leaven from your midst. Others have suggested this might be a reference to something that the Canaanites did, that the Canaanites would actually drink blood as sympathetic magic to sort of imbibe the life force of animals into themselves. But because it was kind of gross to just drink blood by itself, they would mix it with leaven. They'd mix it into bread and eat it that way. And God's saying, no, I don't want you to do anything like the Canaanites are doing at all. God also wants the fat portions for himself, didn't want them keeping that for themselves. And then in verse 19 is another really interesting verse where he tells them, you are not to boil a young goat in the milk of its mother. He actually repeats this 3 times throughout the law. Again, probably this is a reference to a Canaanite practice, a fertility practice. The mother's milk was considered a source of life. And so boiling a goat in its mother's milk was a way to make the rest of the flock have the life of the mother and be productive and all that. And God just knock that off. I don't want any sort of that superstitious magic thought, fertility cult stuff going on among my people. Okay, there may also be something sadistic about it, right? Where it's like the mother's milk is supposed to be like the life force for the baby goat, but you're using this thing that's supposed to give it life to actually kill it and boil it. It's a little bit twisted and dark. So maybe there's some things there. There are some things like that in God's law where God's like, I don't want you mixing things that don't go together. That's a little twisted. That's a little dark. I don't want men dressing like women. I don't want women dressing, like men, acting like, they're the opposite gender. That doesn't mix together. Okay, there were some other things that God would say, I don't want you mixing together. They don't go together. It's a little bit twisted and dark. Don't want you to be that way. It's all part of holiness. Okay. Any comments or questions through verse 19? All right, Brandon's got one.
So for verse 19, the you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk, is that too similar to using an egg to batter a piece of chicken to fry it. So that is a similar idea.
It depends on if that egg was that chicken's egg. So I don't know. I'm making that up. But yeah, I mean, if you kill a hen and then batter it with its own babies, that's a little weird. That's a little dark. But I don't know that there's a way that we can actually know that egg belongs to the chicken unless you actually own those chickens yourself.
It's not fertilized egg.
Say what?
It's not a fertilized egg.
Okay, so maybe that makes a difference. Yeah, it's not. I mean, this is like an actual born goat, you know. And I don't know. I'm not good with agricultural understanding of how chicken eggs work, so I can't. I don't want to venture down that path very far at all. All right, Chris, save me.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like you said this in a way, but we know that God hates paganism. He hates when we worship other gods, and when these pagans make practices that, in the heart and in their purpose, come with pagan intent, and we practice that. Not only are we accepting it into our culture, but we, I think it really takes away from our mindset when we adopt it, and so that might have been the whole point there too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think it's not a perfect comparison, but there are a lot of different religious groups out there today, even many that claim to be Christians, and God's saying, look, I just want you to follow my word and what I'm doing. Don't start copying these other religious groups out here. That's not your standard. I'm your standard. Make sure God says to follow me and my word. So there may be some principles there that we can learn as well. All right, and then verses 20 through 33 is about promises, blessings, warnings. We're running out of time, so I'll just answer why I think this section is so crucial. Number one, it helps them see they can't do any of this without God, because all these laws are about the land of Canaan and what life's going to be like there. And God's saying, you're not going to be in the land of Canaan unless I give it to you. Okay, it's kind of a bookend to the book of the covenant, because at the start of the book of the covenant at chapter 19, he says, remember, I delivered you out of Egypt on eagle's wings. All right, and then here he's saying, I'm going to deliver you the land of Canaan. I'm going to give you that land. So it kind of bookends with God's deliverance. It contains warnings for disobedience and blessings for obedience. It helps to motivate them to keep these laws. I think it provides a perfect balance of motivation, because he motivates them by love for who God is and what he's going to do for them. But he also motivates them by self-interest, because their obedience is going to bring, a better life for them and more rewards. But then he also motivates them by the fear of punishment. If you think about it, that's the same thing he does for us as Christians, right? We're motivated by love, but also self-interest, because it's just, you're going to have peace and joy. If you live the Christian life, generally things are going to go better for you. Okay, and then also there's the fear of punishment, if we don't. Okay, finally, chapter 24. Oh, wow, I keep doing that. I'm so used to clicking on my headings. In chapter 24, the covenant is ratified or made official. This is where the people sign on the dotted line and they say, yes, we will agree to this covenant. And God allows only Moses to come into his direct presence, but he does allow Aaron and Aaron's two sons, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders to kind of come a little bit nearer, than everybody else. It's kind of interesting. Mount Sinai is a foreshadowing of the tabernacle that God is about to give them instructions to build in chapter 25 through 31. You see that God's presence in the form of a cloud is on the top of Mount Sinai. Well, his presence is going to be there in the tabernacle. When they build the tabernacle, there will be only one person who can really enter God's presence in the most holy place, just like Moses is the only one to enter God's presence there. The priests can come closer to God's presence in the tabernacle than the rest of the people. The tabernacle, if you think about it, it's going to be like a portable Mount Sinai. Well, the covenant's ratified. Moses comes down the mountain, verbally speaks to them all the laws of God, and they say all the words which Yahweh has said we will do. And they say it twice. Okay, and there's a lot of cool parallels between the ratification process of the Old Covenant and the ratification process of the New Covenant. Does anybody have any of those comparisons? What did I do here? Sorry. Oh, I skipped that question. That's why I don't have it on the screen. That's why I was so confused. Okay. In what ways does the ratification process of the Old Covenant foreshadow the ratification process of the New here in this chapter? What did you guys have for that? Is that on the sheet either? Joe, you're giving me a funny look.
It is, but I think you need the next question.
I know, that's my point. I left it off the PowerPoint. I don't know why I did that. I don't know how I did that. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Okay, sorry. They sprinkled blood on the people, and Christ's blood will be sprinkled on us figuratively through baptism. So there's a comparison.
Yeah, good. Yeah, Jesus gave himself up as a burnt offering, a whole, complete offering to God. That's what Moses does. They offer a burnt offering to God. They also make a peace offering to God. Jesus is our peace. We get to celebrate that right relationship with God through him, and we get to eat in the presence of God, just like they did. They had a meal with God on that mountain, okay, celebrating the covenant, and we can do the same thing during the Lord's Supper. Well, Moses reascends to Mount Sinai. He leaves Aaron and Hur in charge of handling any cases while he's gone. He's going to be gone for 40 days and 40 nights. And that's where he's going to get the instructions for the tabernacle. Okay, the rest of the class is yours. Are there any other applications to learn from these chapters? Either for the original recipients, for us, or both? Are there any questions about anything that we covered this evening? All right, Joe.
The 40 nights where it was, that was scary for Moses, and it was 40 days, I guess, for Christ to be in the wilderness. They were both for the same time period in not so great places. So,
Okay, yeah, good.
I got one more.
All right, Joe.
Yeah, sorry. So Moses, at the time, I guess Moses brought in a new covenant. Of course, there were laws before, but this was the new covenant for them at the time, and so does Christ. He does the same for us. When he instituted the Lord's Supper and died, he brought in a new covenant. So there was a parallel there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, a lot of great parallels between Jesus and Moses. Both are lawgivers. Both both go up on a mountain and give law. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, he's like Moses going up the mountain and then delivering God's law to the people. Both are mediators. We can't come into contact with God without their mediation. Okay, that's good. All right, still 2.5 minutes. It's going to be awkward. All right, Brandon.
You mentioned the Canaanites drinking the blood and using that as part of their sacrifices and worship. What were they doing to preserve it? And the instruction given to not mix it with leavening, is that turning it into blood sausage is still around today? Or is it something different?
That's a good question. I don't know much about the process of blood sausage, so I can't really speak to that. But yeah, I do think, God still wants us to not drink blood even today. Steak that's medium rare, that's different because that actually was drained first. Okay, he always wanted the animals to be drained because the life is in the blood. It's kind of the explanation that God gives. But yeah, as far as blood sausage, I'd have to know more about the process of how that works in order to answer that. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll just end a minute early because that's all I've got. But thank you guys. I appreciate it. And we'll pick up there on, you can wait for the bell for the rest of the classes. That's fine. We'll just hang out. And we'll pick up there on Sunday. Thank you.